food is a rather modern concept. While I'm not a huge fan, when I'm in a hurry or on the road, I appreciate that I can place an order with a disembodied voice and then pick it up at a window. Years ago, the idea of fast food wasn't even on our radar. We expected to wait for food, whether we were at home or on the road. But now we can get even more food, like not just the meat sandwich that we assume is ground beef, but also our fries, our shake. We can get a salad, we can get breakfast, we can even get a midnight snack in some places. But it's interesting to observe that this fast food, as we have come to know it, has made our patience even shorter. Have you ever gone to a drive-thru and wondered, what's taking so long? Or thought, this is the slowest McDonald's in the world. A growing part of our culture is that when we want something, we want it now. Impatience is part of our flipping through the channels, part of standing at the microwave and drumming our fingers on the counter and waiting white-knuckled at a stoplight to turn green. I'm not sure with our modern mindset that we would have survived wandering for 40 years in the wilderness, or even traveling with Jesus for 3 years. Yet one of the things we learn as we grow and mature as disciples of Jesus Christ is that our time is really in God's hands. Those who leave everything in God's hand will eventually see God's hand in everything. Of course, when we first dedicate our lives to the Lord, we're eager to understand everything, to be able to speak in all situations and know God's will for our lives. But we find that the very action of walking with God for months, for years, for decades is the biggest part of our faith development. One of the reasons the Hebrews wandered in the wilderness for 40 years was to develop their faith, to learn of God, to learn how to work with God, and to learn to depend on God. They would need that knowledge for millennia. And the disciples of Jesus had to do the very same thing. Like the Hebrews, their faith was young and it was also fragile. It was in the day-to-day learning at Jesus' side, which was often frustrating and confusing and frightening, that they learned to know Jesus, how to work with Jesus, and how to depend and trust in Jesus. The leaders of these sojourns, Moses and Jesus, had to deal with the strengths, but also the weaknesses of the followers. And sometimes this was quite a challenge. Two of the big problems in wandering the wilderness of the Holy Land are water and food. Water has been the reason for so many conflicts in the Middle East, from ancient times till the recent. Water and food play an enormous part in the lessons about the wandering of the Hebrews, but also in the scenarios in Jesus' teachings. Sustenance plays an enormous part in our ministries at this church. I often describe the mission drive of our congregation as a feeding mission. We feed people in a lot of ways. The dedication to our emergency food pantry actually lives and breathes in us, as does the Bulldog Bags outreach to feed school children and our support of good neighbors. People are generous in providing money to be sent to other countries for clean water projects. But we also provide spiritual, emotional sustenance through worship, Christian fellowship, and acts of caring and outreach. We recognize that God is the source of our drive to minister to the thirsty and the hungry in all situations. And we see that so clearly in our lessons for today. When the Hebrew people were led out into the wilderness to learn faith, they had only been out there for about 45 days when they began grumbling about food. The food that they had brought with them from Egypt had started to run out. And they again looked back to the bitter slavery. And they thought, well, at least we had food there to eat in Egypt. What has the Lord done to us by bringing us out here to die? And God's response to the grumbling is really interesting, because God did not respond in anger or cynicism or even frustration, which proves yet again how gracious our God is. God's response was to feed the people, but in a way that taught them about faith. Manna, that wafer-like substance, could be collected every morning, but only enough that was needed for each person for a day, teaching the people to literally rely on the Lord for their daily bread. In the evening, quail would descend on the camp and provide meat, as much as they needed for each day. But on Fridays, they would be able to gather enough for 2 days so that they could truly honor the Sabbath and rest. It's a natural thing, I think, for us to rely on ourselves. And God certainly gives us the resources to be on our own in many ways. But God never meant us to be independent in the extreme. God desires an interdependent relationship with us. While God does expect us to be active and to work, we are also accepted to acknowledge our reliance on our Creator and to understand that our abilities and our blessings come from God. Then in our second feeding story that comes from the life of Jesus, we are, I think, most familiar with the story of the feeding of the 5,000. But this is the story of the feeding of the 4,000 men who were counted, not women and children, right? And it's a very different story. After Jesus fed the 5,000, he left the land of Palestine. He had to get away. He was deliberately withdrawing from the Jews. His suffering and death were quickly approaching, and he needed some quiet time away from the crowds that were pressing on him. And he needed safe space from the religious leaders who were trying to entrap him. And so he led his disciples to the far districts of Tyre and Sidon, northeast of Galilee, and outside of the Jewish territory. This is the only occasion on which Jesus traveled outside of his homeland during his adult years. There he thought he would have the gift of anonymity, but he was wrong. Word must have spread because now the Gentiles flocked to him, just as the Jews had. They stayed with him for 3 days without having anything to eat. And Jesus sensed that they were hungry. While they didn't grumble, Jesus' heart ached, and he worried about them. So after taking stock of the supplies, Jesus discovered that they only had 7 loaves and some fish. It really wasn't enough. But the Lord's grace was enough. And this group of Gentiles was fed. In Exodus, we learn that God cares about his people, even in the most dire of circumstances. And in Matthew, we learn that God doesn't just care about the lives of the chosen, but the lives of those beyond the faith circle. And in that divine caring, those who have no claim on belief in God also responded. They were filled. They were changed too. Jesus leads his followers to step beyond themselves, beyond their little group, and care for others, even others who are unknown, who are different, who speak strangely, who do not dress the way we do, who are not us. And it's interesting to take note of the titles these stories have been given. The Exodus story is called Bread from Heaven, which is such an important lesson for us to learn. The Matthew story is called Bread of Life, which not only sustains the community of believers, but offers sustenance of living for those beyond ourselves. The reason we focus so much on giving to others is because God has given to us more than we need, more than we'll ever need. And God's care does not end with us. It goes far out into the world through us.